Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video lecture. Today, in this video, we're going to be talking about inequality. So let's jump right in. So as we see with this topic of inequality, we're actually going into a new section of the class. So far we've covered, lots of different topics. What is sociology, the hidden structures of society, the individual in society, which we've been covering for the last 2 to 3 weeks. And then now we're into a new topic where we're talking about inequality of class, gender, and race. So just so you understand though, this topic of inequality is actually really connected to our last two topics. So inequality is actually part of the structure of society, right? Inequality is how our society is in some sense structured. But inequality is also about individual experience. It's inequality shapes and affects how a person experiences their own life. And so even though we're moving on to a new topic, we're really still kind of covering or, talking about issues that we have been talking for the last, 3 to 4 weeks. Okay, so today we're going to be talking specifically about economic inequality. And so here is, basically the, concepts that we're going to be covering. So I'm going to begin with kind of giving us a little bit of the basic concepts that we need to understand inequality. This will give us, in some sense, the vocabulary to talk about inequality. After this conceptual work, we're going to talk about the economic inequality in the United States, right? So here we'll be seeing a lot of kind of charts and numbers and percentages. The important thing I would say is, don't get bogged down, don't get lost in the numbers. Rather see what the overall story is saying, really kind of see what the numbers are telling you. Right? And then lastly, going to end with a topic of why inequality is bad for everyone. Right? So that inequality produces some negative effects on society, not just for people at the bottom of the economic system, but for everybody. So we'll end with that. Okay, so let's go and start talking about some basic concepts that help us understand the topic of inequality. So the first most basic concept is inequality. And so how can we define this? So essentially inequality is the unequal distribution of social rewards, right? The idea that social rewards get divided up or divvied up in society unequally, right? Everybody doesn't get the same thing, but some people get more or less of this thing called social rewards, right? And so a social reward is anything basically that gives a person a benefit, right? Something that is of value to humans. So normally when we think about a social reward, normally when we talk about inequality, we're thinking about money, right? That's what we naturally go to, right? That when we talk about inequality, we're presuming that we think we're talking about that some people have more money than other people, right? And so money certainly is a social reward, right? Money is useful. Money is something that humans value. However, the important thing is that money is not the only social reward, right? There are other social rewards out there that humans value that are also unequal. So one example of this is status, right? So what is status? Right? Basically, the idea of status is that humans make evaluations of other humans, right? We judge people. We judge them by what we think they're worth. And we call this status. Sometimes it's called prestige or honor, right? And in some sense, it's the kind of a general definition. It's this idea that we think that some people are better than others, right? And by better, we mean things like more intelligent, more sophisticated, more important, more useful, more cultured, right? And so we often connect this to your occupation, that we think that some people's occupations are more important than other people's occupations, right? That some occupations have a higher status than other occupations, right? And so just like money, we give people more or less status. So we have status, we have, this idea that some people are, more or less. We have money, this is a social reward. We can think of other rewards, right? We can think about, things, other things that humans value. So you can, be thinking, what are some of the things that people care about besides, money and status? So we're going to see, health is a good example of one, right? How healthy you are, how how long you can live, right? That's also unequally distributed, right? We sometimes think of health status as just random. Some people are healthier than others, but we're going to see, no, it's not actually random, it's unequal, right? Some people are healthier than others. So their social rewards, come in many different forms. Money is not the only one. But what we also find is that these social rewards tend to go together, right? So people with more money tend to have more status, tend to have better health. And so whereas the social rewards are different, they tend to clump together in a way. Okay, but this gets us going. Inequality, the unequal distribution of social rewards in a society. Some people are given more, some people are given less. Which brings us to the topic of stratification. Right? So how is stratification different from inequality? So what we can basically say is that stratification is the way that the inequality that exists in a society becomes over time a stable hierarchy, right? So the unequal distribution of social rewards over time produces a permanent, more or less permanent social structure in which people are grouped, into certain strata or certain groups, right? And so really the idea of stratification is the idea that inequality becomes something permanent, right? A permanent structure. So really, to kind of get in the background of this, the idea of stratification really comes from geology, right? The idea if you cut down, into the ground, you get certain different forms of rock, sitting one on top of the other, right? And these different rocks are called a strata, right? In sociology, we call it not a geological stratification, but obviously a social stratification, right? And it basically essentially is summed up in the idea of a hierarchy, right? That inequality produces a more or less stable hierarchy in a society that lasts over time, right? Becomes somewhat permanent, right? And so we can see it here in this idea of like upper class, upper middle, lower middle class, working class. We also sometimes talk about it in terms of a ladder. There's rungs on a ladder, and some people are higher up on the ladder, and some people are lower down. So that's stratification. This idea that in every society, there is a somewhat stable hierarchy of rewards that becomes somewhat permanent over time. So what do we call these different strata in the stratification system? We call it class. Right, so let's talk about class. So what is class? Class is basically groups of people in a society that share the same economic resources and have a shared common lifestyle. Right? And so this is what we really think about as class. Right? Class is a word that we talk about is in our general popular vocabulary. We talk about middle class, we talk about upper class, we talk about working class, right? This is class is an idea that we understand. It's in general parlance. And so basically class means that we're grouping people, like people in America, into these broad groups based on having similar economic situations. Right? That people are part of the upper class because they have more economic resources, right? They have more amounts of money than people in the working class. And people in the working class are put into the working class because they have less money, right? Or less income, less of these economic rewards, right? And so it's an idea that we can kind of group people one on top of the other in a form of a hierarchy, saying that, this is how the economic system works in America, that we have a system of hierarchy, based on economic rewards. However, let's be clear. When we're talking about class, actually, we're not just talking about money. Here's where it makes it a little bit more confusing. We're not just talking about economic resources. That's the basis of it. That's the material basis of class. But what we're also talking about is that people of a class share some kind of common lifestyle, right? They share, to a certain degree, a common culture, right? So we can think about this in terms of, the sports that people watch, the TV shows that people consume, even, the brands of things that people buy, where people shop, right? That, it's connected, that class is not just simply about how much money you have, but it's also about what you do with that money, right? What you buy with it, how you consume, right? And so it's not just about economic resources, but it's about kind of having a common lifestyle that groups people into different classes, whether that be working class, middle class, upper class. And so, surprise, surprise, these different lifestyles get different amounts of status, right? And so it's not just that upper class people have more money, but their style of life also gets them more of a higher status, right? And again, we have to remember all this is socially constructed. It's not as if the upper class naturally or innately or essentially have a better lifestyle. No, it's just that that's what we in a society tend to think, right? And so it gets them that higher status. Whereas so there's this kind of connection of status and economic resources that go together with class. Okay, so social classes, we get different amounts of money and status, right? So upper class people get more money, but they also, to a certain degree, get a higher status, right? Working class, lower money, but also to a certain degree, lower status. Again, these are connected to lifestyle, occupation, other things. Okay, so we got a lot of concepts now. We got inequality, unequal distribution of social rewards. We got stratification, how inequality produces a stable hierarchy. We got social class, about the grouping of people in that hierarchy. Now we have social mobility, right? And so essentially, social mobility is the ability of a person or groups of people to move up or down the hierarchy, right? And so mobility is really a measure of how fluid the system is, right? Can you make it? And people really care about this. It's not just that, what's important to people is not just that, that there's a hierarchy, but particularly in this idea of a meritocracy, which many Americans believe in. We want to believe that if you work hard enough, if you do well at school, if you do well at your job, if you're a hard worker, if you're smart, you can make it in America. You can go up in the class hierarchy. You can start off as working class and work your way up and, become middle class or upper class, right? This is we care about mobility almost as much as we do about, inequality and stratification, right? So what are the two forms of mobility, right? So the first form is upward mobility. So being able to move up, right? You start off working class, and then you become middle class and either upper middle or, maybe even upper class. But as well as being upward social mobility, there is, of course, downward social mobility, right? That somebody can squander their money or lose their fortunes or, end up lower in the economic system, right? And so the mobility is really a measure of how fluid the system is, right? Are people moving up and down? Is there a lot of movement in both directions, or is the system really stable, right? That everybody is where they are and they can't get better or they can't get worse. Okay, so that's a general idea of mobility, upward and downward. But now we have to make this a little bit more complex, and we have to talk about intragenerational mobility and intergenerational mobility. Okay, what's the difference here? Intragenerational mobility is the movement within someone's lifetime, right? So somebody is born middle class, they work really hard, they get good grades in school, they go to a job, they keep getting promoted, and by the end of their life, they're upper middle class or they're upper class. They have experienced intra-generational mobility that has been upward, right? What's just as important as intra-generational mobility is intergenerational mobility. So this is the mobility between generations, right? And so here, it's not within your own life, but it's over a number of generations. And to a certain degree, this is what parents really hope for, right? So let's take an example, working class parents, they work hard, they try to save their money, that they might have, not as much economic resources, but they try to, really save it. And they will try to give those resources to their children, right? Send them to college. Why do they do this? They hope that their children will have a better economic future than they will, right? That they may be working class and they may be working class for the rest of their life, but that their children will enjoy a better economic fortune than they will, that their children will be middle class or upper middle class, right? And so that's intergenerational mobility, generational mobility that goes over a number of generations. And to a certain degree, this is what a lot of people care about. They don't care so much about themselves, but they hope that their children and their grandchildren will have a better future than themselves. Okay, we got inequality, we got stratification, we got social class, we got social mobility. We got one more concept, I think. That is the social reproduction of inequality. So the social reproduction of inequality is basically the opposite of social mobility, right? Social reproduction is basically a situation in which the stratification system is permanent, right? That if you're born working class, you're going to die working class, and your children are going to be working class, and your parents were working class, right? And the reverse is true. If you're upper class, your grandparents were upper class, and your parents were upper class, and your children are going to be upper class, and your grandchildren will be upper class, right? That the idea of social reproduction is that the class membership gets reproduced over and over again, right? That there is not mobility. And so what we can generally say in terms of the industrialized West, so places like North America and Europe and other places, is that there is actually a lot of social reproduction, right? That people who are upper class tend to remain upper class, and people who are working class tend to remain working class. So one fascinating study of this is that some British scholars did a study of the people who went to Oxford and Cambridge. So Oxford and Cambridge are two universities that have been around for a very long time, for about 800 years, right? And membership to these universities is pretty much a sign that you are upper class, right? It's like going to Harvard or something like that, or Yale or an Ivy, right? It's a symbol of your upper class status, right? And so what they found was that people who have been going to Oxford and Cambridge have the same unusual last names over the last 1,200 years, right? So British people, they have some interesting last names. And so what we find is those interesting last names keep showing up in the rolls of Oxford and Cambridge, right? So an example of this is Mandeville, right? Kind of like a little bit of an unusual name. And so the surname Mandeville keeps appearing in Oxford and Cambridge over the last 1,200 years. I mean, what are they getting at? What do we care? Well, it shows basically that people are passing down their class status, right? That the Mandevilles have been passing down their class status from 1200 AD to the contemporary era. One more example of this. Here we have the Bazalgettes. So here we have Sir Joseph Bazalgette, who was a Victorian engineer of the 19th century. He was a lord, right? He was upper class. He's part of membership of the government. Very upper class. And then we have his great grandson, Sir Peter Bazalgette, who is, surprise, surprise, also upper class, right? Chairman of the Arts Council in England, also a sir, right? Also a lord, right? And so the argument here is, how did Sir Peter Bazalgette get to be in the upper class? Well, it got passed down to him, right? And this shows, the reproduction of inequality. That once you're in the upper class, you remain in it, and your children and ancestors will remain in it. Okay, so here are our concepts. Here is the way that we can begin to think about inequality and talk about it. Okay, now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about inequality in America. We want to know is how much inequality is there in America? How much mobility? Is there social reproduction of inequality? What's going on? Okay, so first let's talk about how you measure inequality, because I'm soon going to show you a lot of charts and figures, and so you want to be able to understand them. All right, so one important difference is the measurement between income and wealth. So income is the amount of money that you're getting in on a regular basis, right? So your weekly income or your monthly income or your annual income, right? How much money, how much economic resources are you acquiring, on a regular basis? Wealth, on the other hand, is the total amount of your savings. How much money do you have right now, right? And wealth doesn't just include your liquid resources, the amount of money in your bank account, but it also measures all your kind of everything of value that you own, your car, your house, your boat, right? And so wealth isn't just about money in a liquid form. Wealth is about capital. It's about all the things of value that you own. Okay, so there's a difference here between income and wealth, and we're going to see inequality varies between these two things. Next, we have how do we measure this? We can measure income and wealth in terms of quintiles and deciles. Okay, so let's talk about quintiles first. All right, so let's divide up the American population into 20% groups, right? We divide up all Americans into 20% groups, right? So there's 5 of them, right? So we have the richest 20%, the next wealthiest 20%, the next wealthiest 20%, and then all the way down to the poorest 20%, right? And so what we're saying is, okay, what's the differences in the wealth of these groupings? So here's the way I imagine it, right? Let's imagine that everybody in America puts all their money into a big stadium, right? Some big stadium somewhere, right? And we just get all our cash, all our cars, all our boats, all our houses, everything of value in America, and we just shove it into the stadium. It's massive, right? It's there's gold bricks in there. It's just this massive pile of wealth. And so now the question is, when we're talking about quintiles, is okay, well, how much of that total wealth, how much of the total wealth of America that's in that stadium, how much does the richest 20% get? Right? Does it get 20%? Does it get more than 20%? Right? How much of that total wealth does the poorest 20% get? Do they get 5%? Do they get 10%? Right? And so the question when we're talking about quintiles is, how much of the total wealth of America does each 20% of Americans get? Right? And that makes sense, I think. And then deciles are the same thing, but just a little bit more finely tuned in terms of 10% groupings. Okay, so we got basically the idea of how we're going to do this. We got income, we got wealth, we got quintiles, we got deciles. Let's get to the actual numbers. Okay, so here's our first chart. So here we're looking at wealth in America now. Okay, so if wealth in America now, if income and inequality was equal, each 20% would get 20% of the total wealth and the total income, right? If we had complete equality, each 20% groupings would get 20%, right? Nobody would be richer or poor. Everybody would be, exactly the same. Obviously, that's not where we are. So let's see where we actually are. So we can first talk about income. Right? So what we see is on the left side, the light blue, this is the top, the richest 20%. And so what we're seeing here from about 10 years ago, this data is pretty much stayed the same in the last decade, is that the richest 20% have about 50% of the total income of America, right? Whereas the poorest 20% is that small dark blue sliver at the top, right? So the poorest 20% have about 3.3%. Right? So this is income, and so what we see here is that the top quintile has about 15 times the amount of income as the poorest quintile, right? The richest 20% of Americans earn about 15 times the amount of income as the poorest 20% of Americans. Right? So that's income. Now we want to look at wealth. Oh, whoops, we're still on income. Okay, so again, we can do the same thing in terms of measuring it in different ways, deciles and stuff like that. And also, people like to talk about the top 1% when we talk about income. And so what we see here is, this is a pretty stark, pretty good representation of income in America. And so what we see here is, right, the average income of the 90% of Americans is about $33,000 a year, whereas the average income of the top 1% is about $1,250,000 roughly, right? And so we see here that's it's a pretty stark difference in terms of the economic situation of the vast majority of Americans and the top 1% of Americans. Right? So again, this is income inequality. So if we were in class, I would have you do these guesses, but we're not in class. So we're going to skip right to the answers. All right, so we can talk about wealth. Right, so this is wealth inequality. So again, from 2007, the data stays pretty much the same. The recession of 2008 affected it somewhat, but the general story is mostly the same. Okay, so what do we find? So what we find is that the top 1% of Americans have about 35% of the total wealth of Americans. The top 5% of Americans have about 62% of the wealth. The top 10% of Americans have about 80% of the wealth. Yes. And then the top 20%, the top quintile, has basically all the wealth of America, right? The top 20% of Americans have 95% of the total wealth of all America. All right, what about the other end of the spectrum? What about the bottom, the working class or working class? So what we see is at the bottom 40%. So we have to put them in the 40% since their sliver is so small, you can't even represent it in terms of 20%. But the bottom 40% of Americans have 0.2% of the total wealth of America. And so what we see here is, a pretty fair degree of inequality in America. We see the top 10% owning nearly, nearly all the wealth, right? 80%, 85%, and the bottom 40% owning basically nothing, right? And so, there is this huge discrepancy, in terms of the amount of wealth inequality in America. And so what we see is, wealth inequality is more unequal than income inequality. All right, and see again, different ways of representing the same thing. All right, and so what we see is, the bottom 80% of Americans have about 5% of the total financial wealth. Have about 5% of the total financial wealth of America, whereas the top 20% therefore have about 95% of the total financial wealth. right? And so, the upper class, or, we think of the 20% as basically, a representation of the upper class. The upper class in America possesses basically the vast majority of all wealth in America. Okay, so we got the degree of inequality, and we can see in America that both in terms of income and wealth, there is a fair degree of inequality, right? That the top 10%, top 20% have much more income and much more wealth than the majority of the population. Okay, what about social mobility? How possible is it in America to make it, right? To get ahead. Right? We think of ourselves as a meritocracy, that if you work hard and study and do your job, that you can better yourself and better your economic situation. And so we want to know, how true is that? Is America a meritocracy? And the answer is kind of yes and no, right? It's not a complete yes, but it's not a complete no either. Okay, so this graph is a little bit harder to understand, so let me talk you through it. So basically what we have is along the bottom, right, the columns, we have your parents' family income, right? So on the left, we see the the poorest 20% of parents, right? And then on the right, we have the richest 20% of parents, right? And so these parents, obviously because they're parents, they have children. And so we want to know with social mobility, right? Do the children do better, right? Do the children of working class parents, do they do better than their parents? Is there movement upwards, right? Is there mobility, or is inequality being socially reproduced? And so the answer is a little bit mixed. So let's look at the left-hand column here, the bottom 20%. And so what we see here is about 43% of the children of parents in the bottom 20% remain in the bottom 20% themselves, right? So if your parents are working class, there's about a 43% chance that you're going to be working class. So that's, it's a pretty substantial odds. But some people do make it, right? Some people do better themselves, right? So we see, about 27% are able to make it up to the next quintile. 17% are able to make it up 2 quintiles. And there's even 4% who are able to make it all the way to the top, right? But, that's a pretty slim chance, right? That's only 4%. And so, yes, there is some ability. People can make it, and they do make it. But if they, there a lot of people remain stuck. A lot of people whose parents are in the working class are themselves going to be in the working class. And if they do make it, they're going to make it into like the middle class. It's not going to be rags to riches. It's going to be rags to middle class. Right? And so we see this all the way. It's true for the wealthy as well, or the rich. Right? So we look at the top 20%. Right? We see a similar story. Right? About 40% of them will remain in the upper class. And if they fall, if they have downward social mobility, they're going to go like 1 rung or 2 rungs below. They're not going to go all the way to the bottom. Some people do, right? Again, about 8% go all the way to the bottom, lose their fortune, so to speak. But most people are staying where they are. So what I would say is there is some social mobility in America, but there is also a lot of social reproduction. Okay, now we want to look at inequality over time. Now the question is, in America, have things gotten more or less equal, right? Has inequality increased over time? Or has inequality gone down over time, say in the last 50, 60 years, right? So you can kind of be thinking in your head, what do you think right now? Has inequality gotten worse or better? So here's the answer. Inequality has gotten much worse, right? So what we see is that inequality has progressively gotten, American society has progressively gotten more unequal over the last 40 to 50 years, right? So the bottom, we see here the earnings of people in the bottom 10%. And we see that their weekly income really hasn't gotten that much better, right? It has stayed pretty close to the same, especially taking care of inflation, whereas the wealth of the top 10%, that's the red line, you see that their wealth has gotten a lot better in terms of weekly income. And you can kind of just see in 1979, the lines are much closer together than they are in 2013. Right? And so what we see here is just an increase in inequality. The lines are splitting. And we see this again and again, we see this in many different stories, right? So what we see, this is now in terms of wealth, pretty sure. Actually, no, still in terms of income. What we see is that in 1965, the top 10% had about 7 times the amount of income as the bottom 10%. But by 2013, now it's increased to about 12 times the amount of income. So we see that the gap between rich and poor has gotten bigger, right? So it is true that the wealthier have gotten wealthier and the poor have remained poor. Right? And we can see this in terms of wealth. Right? So what we see here is that the top 10% really have increased their wealth, the degree of wealth that they possess, of the total American wealth. Right? So we see, that their amount that they possess in the amount they possessed in 2013 is much greater than they possessed in 1989. What we see is that the middle class, that kind of red bar there, they have remained pretty much where they are, right? They basically have a pretty much similar percentage. And then we see the bottom 50%, right? The poorest 50% of America, and they pretty much remain where they are too, which is having very little wealth, right? Very little savings, kind of just getting by week to week. Right? And so what we really see, not just in terms of income, right? So the wealthy, the rich have not just increased the amount of income they have gotten, but they have also dramatically increased the degree of wealth that they now possess. Right? And we see this again here, another stark representation. So from 1979, the top 1% increased their wealth by 280%. The top 20% increased it by 95%, whereas other people did much less, right? Their wealth went up a bit, but not to the same degree as the wealthy, right? And so what we see here is the wealthier getting wealthier, right? Getting more unequal in terms of other Americans. How can we explain this? Why to a certain degree is there more income and wealth inequality? Why is it going up? So one way to think about this is what happens after a recession. So American economy goes through a series of expansions, right, where there is more productivity, there's more income growth, there's lower unemployment, things are getting better. And then there are periods of recession, right, where unemployment goes up, GDP falls, income falls, things are bad, right? And so what you have is these cycles of expansion and then recession. So recession, then expansion, then recession, then expansion. And so what we find is that in the most recent expansions that come after a recession, the wealthy have really gotten wealthier, right? So after the Great Recession of 2008, what we see is that the bottom 80% of Americans really didn't gain that much afterwards, right? They pretty much stayed where they were, or really, kind of lost a little bit, right? Whereas the richest 20%, right, the top bar there, their incomes have gained by about 2%, and the top 5%, their incomes have gained by about 5%. So what we see is that after the Great Recession, people's incomes really stagnated, right? Their incomes remained the same. They didn't really see that much of an increase, except if you were in the top 20%, then you saw your incomes increase, right? Which again produces more inequality. And so that's a pretty typical story, that in the last 20 to 30 years, the wealthy have been gaining more after a recession than the majority of Americans. Okay, what about how does America compare to other countries? Are other industrialized countries as unequal as America, or is America an exception? So what we can say is there is a similar pattern in other industrialized countries. So here we have the UK wealth inequality from 2018, and we see, it's a pretty similar story to America. So the top 20% have 40% of the wealth. The bottom 20% have about 8% of the wealth, right? Here we have Canada, right? Again, the top 20% have about 40% of the wealth. The bottom 20% have about 7% of the wealth. Here we have Australia. Australia has the top 20% have about 60% of the wealth, and the bottom 20% have about 0. Yeah. So there's a similar pattern of America with other countries. However, America is more unequal, right? So whereas there's a similar pattern, America is generally speaking more extreme than other countries, right? That in terms of wealth inequality and income inequality, America really is number one, right? That it tends to be one of the most unequal industrialized countries in the world. We can see this here. America has, is all the way to the right here, only beat by Switzerland and Denmark in terms of the share of the top 10% of their wealth. Right, and so what we see here is over time, going back to this idea as has inequality gotten worse over time, what we see is yes, that's true, and it's not just true for America, it's true for all countries, that over time in the last 30 to 40 years, the West, the industrialized world, has gotten more and more unequal. But what we see here is, again, America tends to be a little bit of an exception in that it's the more extreme case, right? America is the light blue line all the way at the top, right? So we see in the 1970s and 80s, America was kind of in the pack, so to speak. It was the same amount of inequality as the other countries. But after that time, by 21st century, it's really kind of at the top. It's more unequal, much more unequal than other countries, even though all countries have gotten more unequal over time. Okay, so let's try to sum this up. There's a lot of statistics, a lot of numbers. So let me try to sum this up in kind of a simplified form. All right, so what can we first say? America has a fair degree of inequality. So, some things I will say in this class are an opinion or, a theory or a concept, and I'll say to you, oh, you can take this or leave it, or, it's up to you to make your own opinion. This is basically a fact, right? America has a large degree of inequality. Any way you measure it, it's what it is, right? And we can argue about whether that's good or bad or something like that. But arguing the fact of it is not really that possible, right? So we can simply say, as a fact, America has a fair degree, a large degree of inequality. America has some mobility, meaning that it's possible to get ahead. It's also possible to go down, but it also has a fair degree of social reproduction, right? That the social class of your parents is probably a pretty good determination of what your social class is going to be. And so to a certain degree, it's possible to move up in America, but a lot of people are just stuck, right? A lot of people are just stuck where they are. If your parents are poor, good chance that you're going to be poor. Same if your parents are wealthy. If your parents are wealthy, good chance you're going to be wealthy. There is some mobility. There's a lot of social reproduction. the level of inequality in America has gone up, right? And it has gone up pretty significantly, right? And it is high in comparison to other countries, right? Other countries are also unequal, but America is more unequal than the vast majority of other countries. So that's a kind of pretty good, pretty simple summary of inequality in America. Okay, on to the last topic. Why do we care about inequality? Right? We've got all this stuff, the facts, the numbers, percentages, quintiles. Why do we care? Right? So I would say that there's maybe a couple reasons that we care. Right? One reason that we care about inequality is this idea of social justice, right? Or the idea that what kind of society do we want to live in? Do we want to live in an unequal society? Do we care about inequality? Is that something that we care about, right? And how much inequality are we willing to have? That's not really a question I can answer. It's up for citizens. It's up for all of us to decide. What we think about inequality. How much inequality are we willing to have? What is it? What do we think about it? And that's a kind of a bit of a normative question. However, there's another reason that we care about inequality. The second reason we care about inequality is that inequality tends to produce negative social effects, right? That inequality tends to produce more problems in a society. Let me show you some examples. All right, okay, so inequality produces more social problems and overall worse health. Right? So let's first talk about life expectancy. We're going to talk a little bit more on this on Thursday. And so what we see here is that, right, so at the bottom we have what's called a Gini coefficient. A Gini coefficient goes from 0 to 1 and is basically a measure of inequality. If it's 0, then it's complete equality, like everybody has the same. If it's 1, then everybody is it's completely unequal, right? There's one person who has all the wealth and everybody else has nothing, right? And so you have a number from 0 to 100 or 0 to 1, but sometimes put 0 to 100. That's a measure of inequality. And so what we see here is that as inequality goes up, as it goes from 20 to 45, the life expectancy goes down. That countries with more inequality have lower life expectancies. So we can see here on this graph, where's America? You can see that's at the bottom and the right, right? And so yes, America, as we have described, has a high rate of inequality and also has actually, in comparison to other industrialized countries, a lower life expectancy. Right? So again, making that argument, the connection here, relationship, right? That a higher inequality might be related to a lower life expectancy. Although we always have that question, correlation doesn't always equal causation, but a lot of times it does. Okay, what about else? What about infant mortality? So infant mortality is the number of infants that die before the age of 1, right, per 1,000 infants. And so again, what we see is a similar story. Countries that have a higher degree of income have now a higher degree of infant mortality. Right? So the more inequality a country has, the more if its infants are going to die. And we see that this is also true for America. Right? America, actually, in terms of industrialized countries, has one of the highest infant mortality rates. Right? Much higher than Japan, Australia, England. Right? We have one of the highest infant mortality rates in the world, in the industrialized world, right? And so again, there's this relationship here between the amount of inequality we possess and our, outcomes like infant mortality. What about other things? What about other health issues? Obesity. So again, what we see is same story again and again. Countries with a high degree of inequality have higher rates of obesity. Again, what we can see is, where is America? America is at the top and the right. High degree of inequality, high percentage of obesity. What about mental illness? Right here, we see, countries with more inequality have more mental illness. Mental illnesses like depression, anxiety, things, kind of a measured scale, right? So again, there seems to be this relationship between inequality and mental illness. What about a social problem like drug use? Right. So here, drug use, you're talking about a range of drugs, including cannabis. So it's throwing cannabis in there can be tricky. But other things like opiates, cocaine, ecstasy, and meth. Right. And so again, we see countries that have a high degree of inequality have a higher degree of drug use in their societies. Again, where we can see is where's America? America is at the top and the right. High degree of inequality and a higher degree of drug use. All right, what about teenage pregnancies? All right. So again, the similar story. Countries with a high degree of inequality have a higher rate of teenage births. We think of teenage births as being a social problem. Are people who are teenagers, are they ready to be parents? Right? They're typically, having children out of wedlock. Right? So we think of it as a problem. And what we see is countries with more inequality have more teenage births, whereas America is top right, right? High degree of inequality and a high degree of teenage births. And so you can put all these things into a scale, right? One big scale: life expectancy, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage births, obesity, mental illness, social mobility, right? We put all these things into a scale that, can say, oh, what's an overall measure of the quality of a society? And again, what we find is countries that have a high degree of inequality have more problems, right? The more inequality you have, the more problems you're going to have. More inequality, more problems, right? Whereas America is top right, right? High degree of inequality, and on this scale, much more problems. Okay, so what's happening here? All right, so far, hopefully I've made the argument that inequality is not just bad for people at the bottom of the economic spectrum, right? Not just bad for people who are poor, but is negative for everybody in society, produces some negative, harmful effects. And so we can ask, well, what's going on? Why does inequality do this? So there's a few things. First is simply inequality produces poverty, right? The more inequality you have, the more poverty you have. If you have inequality, a lot of inequality in your society, you got a lot of people who are poor. And poverty comes with a whole range of social problems. It comes with lower life expectancy. It comes with a whole other host of issues. And so with it, more inequality, you get more poverty, and that poverty is going to cause your society problems, right? And you're going to spend money on that problem. What else? Inequality produces less investment in social services, right? And so what we find here is that countries that are more unequal invest less in social services. So social services are things like healthcare, education, public health, other things, right? And so again, that's what tends to be true for America. Sometimes we think that America is highly taxed, or we have this preconception that the tax rate in America is really large or something like that. But it's actually not true. In comparison to most other countries and the OECD average, America has a relatively low tax rate, right? And so we're not overtaxed, right? And so the tax rate is actually really a measure of the amount of money that we devote towards social services, right? General measure, a rough measure, right? And so our lower tax rate is basically saying that we're devoting less money to things like education, public health, healthcare, right? We're not putting as much resources into that problem, right? And so again, that tends to cause problems. You can see this in terms of the coronavirus, right? Less investment in public health and healthcare is producing a less managed response, I would argue. Okay, so we got more inequality produces more poverty. Inequality produces less investment in social services. Inequality produces more stress, right? Stress is not good for people, right? So stress is a physiological reaction as well as a psychological reaction. Stress is people are stressed out. They have higher blood pressure. They do health behaviors that are not good for them, like eating, to de-stress, smoking tobacco, right? And so inequality is producing stress. What's happening? Basically, what the idea here is that if you live in an unequal society like America, you're experiencing a lot of competition, right? You're experiencing people who are trying to get ahead, trying to be better than each other, trying to be competitive, trying to make it. And that this sense of competition, this culture of competition, produces a lot of stress within people. And that stress is actually harmful to people's health and well-being. Right? And so the more unequal society is, the more competition in that society, producing a lot more stress for people to live in that society, in a certain degree, less happiness. Fourth, inequality is decreasing the collective social capital. Okay, so now we have to remember what collective social capital is. And we go all the way back to this idea of social networks. So if you remember, social capital is how much people are connected to one another, right? A high degree of with a high degree of collective social capital, everybody's connected, right? People know each other's names, people go to the PTA meeting, people invite each other, they know their neighbors, people are connected, right? With a low degree, people are disconnected from one another, right? They don't know each other's names, they're strangers. So basically what's happening is that with inequality, it's separating people, right? When people are unequal, they don't feel in it together. They don't feel like that they are connected to other people of different economic classes. Like people feel more competitive, people feel resentful that other people have more money than them, right? People get more disconnected the more inequality there is, right? It harms the social fabric. It harms the sense of togetherness in a society, right? And so the collective social capital gets less, right? What this means then is we are less able to cope with and combat social problems, right? As we are more and more disconnected, we as a society can't come together to tackle a problem. Let me sum this up in by talking a little bit about politics, right? So if you remember earlier in the class when we talked about collective social capital, I made the argument that we were politically divided as a country. And I think that's pretty clear to see. Right? So you see, this graph here, you see that over time, the average Democrat and the average Republican in Congress have gotten consistently farther apart. Democrats have gotten more liberal and Republicans have gotten more conservative, right? And so that you see the two parties splitting, moving further apart to their extremes, right? And then moreover, we see that many people in these parties don't trust one another, right? So 20%, 27% of Democrats see the other party as a threat to the country, and 30% of Republicans see the Democratic Party as a threat to the country. So that's really kind of hating each other, right? And so the argument here is that what's a root cause of this? Why have we begun to hate each other? And I would make the argument that one of the root causes is inequality, right? That as we have become a more unequal society, we have a less of a feeling of togetherness. As people's economic situations and experiences have become more and more separated, that we have poorer people over here and wealthy people over here, their lives have divided. The way they see the world, the way they think about it, the way they think about politics is now very different from one another because their economic situations are different. As that has happened, we have become more and more disconnected from one another, right? And so inequality, I would say, is the kind of last argument about why it's bad, or what's the negative effects of it, is that it has really made us hate one another, right? That it has made us more divided as a country, right? It has decreased our level of national solidarity. We no longer feel like we're in it together because of how different we are economically. Right? And we see this, as inequality has increased over time, so have our polarized politics. So that's the lesson for today, right? Some basic concepts about inequality in America now and over time, and why inequality produces some negative effects in our society, why it's bad for everybody, not just people at the bottom of the economic ladder.